Thank you all for joining the session, and my name is Nabil Saeed. I'm a product marketing manager at the account security division here at Twilio, and I'll be talking today about some of the lessons we've learned while implementing stronger security for online transactions and what we can share with you developers over here. So just to run through what you guys can expect today, I'll be talking a little bit about open banking and what that means in the overall financial services sector, and how that trend kind of conflicts with the other trend of securing payments and a framework in Europe for that is legislating open banking and stronger security in payments, and then also kind of the lessons we've learned from our customers that have implemented doing that. So how many of you here know about or have heard about open banking? Okay, a few of you, great. So as some of you, may know, and the rest of you would behoove you to know, open banking is kind of a global trend that is pushing banks to open up their APIs for third parties to access transaction information. And the goal of open banking is basically to give third parties the ability to access transaction information so they can provide better products and services based on the principle of the consumer owning transaction data and not the banks. So rather than the banks having a monopoly over this information, by opening it up, it provides for an ecosystem where innovation can happen and new services are introduced. So some of the initial use cases that we're seeing are around account aggregation services, quicker credit assessments, personal finance management, and payment initiation. And all of this is basically meant to make it easier for consumers to move, manage, and make more out of their money. So none of this functionality is actually new per se. We've actually had players like Mint or Contomatic, Yodlee that have been providing these kind of services. But traditionally, the way it's been done is that users have had to share their login credentials, and then third parties then use those credentials to scrape information from the banks. Obviously, as you can imagine, this is neither very safe nor very elegant. So what basically open banking does is that by opening up APIs, third parties can access this information without the users having to share username or password. Thereby, intrinsically, it's a little bit more secure and also it's more efficient. However, when you have this open framework of anyone accessing finite transaction information, there's always the risk that goes along with it. So, for example, even without open banking, last year alone, there was $22 billion in online payments fraud. And this number is actually set to more than double over the next few years to nearly $50 billion. And mind you, this is in the current framework without open banking. So you can only imagine that as banks open up their APIs, with this new opportunity comes additional risk. So much so that the study by Juniper Research done in November last year found that 44% of all financial services companies cite payments fraud as their #1 concern. More than customer friction, more than customer satisfaction, this is the #1 thing that financial services companies are concerned about. So how do you reconcile these two divergent yet conflicting trends of open banking on one hand and then navigating through fraud on the other? If we look at the world's biggest open banking legislative framework that's currently in place in Europe, I think it'll be good to look at some of what they're implementing over there and how we can learn some of those lessons and use them in our implementations. So in Europe, they have this framework called the Revised Payment Services Directive, or PSD2. And what PSD2 essentially does is that it's meant to encourage innovation and competition by homogenizing what was previously Europe's fragmented and disjointed banking ecosystem into a much more fluid and open banking framework that more closely represents the European economic zone. And what this has done is that it has actually spurred the innovation of some payment disruptors, such as the ones on your screen here, which some of you may be familiar with. And PSD2 basically has two essential mandates. The first one being for that banks need to open up their APIs for third parties to access the information, authorized third parties. And the second is what we're going to be talking about more here, is around introducing stronger security to payments. And that is what they call strong customer authentication. The idea is that as third parties, authorized third parties, have more and more access to this data, we need to implement an equivalent or commensurate measure to improve security in transactions. And we'll be going through some of the requirements that they've introduced and how we can learn from that, whether or not we're in Europe or wherever we are. So strong customer authentication it's kind of like two-factor authentication. It's just a stronger form of authentication, which is in effect anytime the payer is accessing their account information online, anytime they are initiating an electronic transaction. So anytime I'm paying someone, whether it's a payment to a merchant or a payment to another peer over Venmo or something like that, or if I'm doing something that deviates significantly from my established baseline of normal behavior, what is deemed risky. So most of you here probably know what two-factor authentication is. And basically, strong customer authentication is similar to that with an additional added caveat, with an additional layer of security. But basically, for strong customer authentication, like 2FA, you need to have at least two of the three factors listed on the screen over here. So whether that's something I know, my password, something I possess, such as my phone or my YubiKey, or something that is intrinsic to my being, whether it's my iRetina scan or my thumbprint. And this form of authentication is actually going to go into effect as early as next month. Some of the finer details are still being fleshed out around this, but as of right now, this strong customer authentication is set to go into effect in Europe in next month, in a few weeks, really. So which means that payments could actually start being declined if they don't comply with strong customer authentication. Now, this actually has ramifications not just for Europe, but really worldwide. As I mentioned, open banking is a global phenomenon. There's initiatives taking place in Australia, in Singapore. The United States is taking more of a laissez-faire approach, but there's increasing amount of open banking disruptors over here as well. So whether or not you're in Europe and you're legally mandated to implement this, or really you just want to reduce the likelihood of your payments being subject to fraudulent interference, I think the ROI for introducing stronger transactions applies across the board. So as I mentioned, strong customer authentication is like 2FA, but with an additional layer of security. And that layer of security is what is called in legalese dynamic linking. And I think it's a really interesting concept because it really takes what is traditional 2FA into a more robust form of security that is specific to transactions. So as the European Banking Authority defines it, dynamic linking is a measure introduced to prevent man-in-the-middle attacks, which is when someone can interfere with your authentication code and use it for other nefarious purposes. And it's also based on the principle of user consent. So the first requirement, according to the legal document of the European technical requirements, is that the payer is made aware of what they're paying, right? So I cannot just be given an authentication code that doesn't have any context, right? This holds to the principle of what I see is what I sign. So I can't just be given a code without any sort of information around it. I need to be shown how much I'm paying, to whom I'm paying, and then that code is specific to that transaction. So, and what this does is that it gives the user confidence that they're authenticating the right transaction and not something else. Secondly, when I'm generating a code, it cannot just be a random set of digits. It actually needs to contain or be derived from the transaction details itself. Now, you can imagine that how doing this makes for an intrinsically more secure code, because let's say even if someone were to interfere and have access to my code, as long as the code contains information about the transaction amount and the recipient, there's very little that a hacker or a fraudster can do with that. So the code that I'm generating for a payment needs to be calculated from that payment information, whether it's the payment amount, payment time, the recipient, or all of the above. The more factors you include in your code, the stronger and more fraud-proof it becomes. Additionally, once I've generated a set of codes, for example, I've generated an OTP that I'm sending over SMS, or I'm also sending a time-based one-time passcode. If I'm generating multiple codes, once I've accepted a code, all other channels get invalidated. So what that means is that there's no outstanding code that someone can have access to and then use that to authenticate a payment that I did not authorize. And then lastly, if anything changes in the payment, then all codes I need to generate a new code. So for example, if I'm buying a table from my friend and I'm paying him over Venmo for $50 or 50 euros in this case, and then I have to authenticate that payment. Let's say I say that, hey, I want to add the chairs too. And he's like, okay, I'll give it to you for 75 euros. Now he needs to generate now the payment services provider would need to generate another code, because that code that was generated initially is specific to $50 and that recipient. So anything changes, I need to generate a new code. And what that means is that all outstanding codes get invalidated. Now you might be thinking that these additional requirements are quite stringent and would introduce a lot of friction to payments, and that's actually fair. So the regulations body has actually allowed for exemptions based on certain criteria. And the first and most important of these is establishing risk scores or fraud rates. The idea is that as I process payments over time, I should be able to establish a baseline around which I can flag any deviations and only require authentication for those high-risk payments. So what they have in place in Europe, for example, is that under 30 euros, you don't need any authentication at all. Between 30 and 100 euros, the fraud rate is like 0.08. Between 100 and 250 euros, it's like 0.05. 250 to 500 euros, it's 0.01. And above 500, all transactions require authentication. So the idea is that you have an inverse relationship with the likelihood of fraud and how strongly you need to authenticate the payment. There are also exceptions for recurring payments. So if I, for example, have my phone bill that is $100 a month, then I don't need to authenticate that every time after the initial authentication, except if my bill varies significantly. So if it's typically $100 and all of a sudden it's $250, a flag goes up and now I need to authenticate that. So how are customers implementing strong customer authentication? As I said, the deadline is next month, and a lot of customers are putting systems in place to meet these requirements. So the first and most important, I guess the most significant means by which companies will be meeting these requirements is via a system called 3D Secure 2.0. Now, 3D Secure is basically an opt-in system where the payment services provider can enroll in a system of data sharing where they can take advantage of the first exemption that was given to low-risk transactions. 3DS is implemented by the card providers, and basically it allows every merchant to take advantage of the vast pool of transaction information that MasterCard and Visa have. And the idea is that with their amount of information, they can actually ascribe a very accurate fraud score to each transaction, right? So I don't need to have had millions of transactions. I'm actually tapping into Visa's pool, and they will be the ones flagging or not flagging a transaction as exempt. And if it's exempt, I don't need to make my user go through the added friction. So it actually uses a lot of data points, such as user information, location, device data, and to really get a very comprehensive set of information around each transaction that people can tap into. But there's many cases, for example, if the transaction is over $500, then you need to implement SCA, and that's, we're going to be talking about some of the ways that people have done that. So the simplest way to actually be compliant with SCA, although this does have problems, is via SMS, right? I mentioned the requirements for dynamic linking. And as long as your SMS-based code meets those requirements, you can use SMS as a channel to deliver the dynamically linked authentication code. The good thing is that it doesn't require any app from the end user. It's very simple to implement. And from a developer point of view, you can easily include the transaction details, as I've shown on my screen, in the body of the text itself. However, problems with SMS delivery and security or lack of security around SMS have been well documented. And things like the SS7 attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, phishing attacks, these are all very common vectors that target SMS. And especially if you think about it now, that if you're including transaction information within the body of the text itself, it's potentially a lot more problematic than just a random code being out there. But now you actually have the code and the recipient and the transaction amount. So you can imagine how that could cause a lot more problems. In fact, just last month in Germany, the German banking authority deemed SMS as an invalid channel for delivering codes. So while technically you could deliver dynamically linked codes via SMS, it's not secure. And I think increasingly more and more governmental authorities and regulatory bodies are beginning to acknowledge that risk and respond with legislation of the kind. So how do you, if you're not going to use SMS, what other channels are there? Is everyone familiar here with TOTP? I see a couple of hands. TOTP is basically a time-based one-time passcode. And the way it works is that I would give a shared secret to my authentication service. And then it uses that shared secret plus the time of day to to come up with a code. So there doesn't need to be any, because of my second device, my second factor is calculating a code, there's actually nothing being transmitted. Right? And if there's nothing being transmitted, there's nothing to intercept. So for example, if I'm on the plane and I'm connected on my laptop, and now I need to authenticate, my phone, which is not connected, which is in airplane mode, can still generate a TOTP because it has the shared secret and it keeps track of the time. But when you have the dynamic linking requirement that the code cannot be random, and it actually needs to be calculated from transaction details, how do you bridge that gap then? How can the second factor that is offline contain information about a transaction that I just made? So this is a problem that we foresaw, and a few of our customers presented to us. And what we did was we introduced what we call transactional TOTP. And like regular TOTP, it works offline, but we used a trick to transmit the transaction details to our device. And I'm going to walk you guys through a little demo that shows you exactly how that works. So what we did was we can actually, if you have the Authenticator app on your phone, then what you can simply do is use a QR code. So I'm going to go ahead and submit, like if I'm a developer, if I'm in my application, I could basically implement a QR code that I generate, and then once I scan it on my phone, and you can see my phone is on airplane mode, but it's giving me this transaction information. So thereby, without having to go online, And in a completely secure way, because I'm not even going, there's nothing to intercept, I was able to give a dynamically linked code to my offline second factor and generate a code which I can then use to authenticate. Let's click mark this as done, and go back. And the cool thing about this is that, like regular TOTP, this is also based on the RFC standard, which means that all existing requirements for TOTP are also met by transactional TOTP. And apart from just securing payments, there's actually a lot of other use cases around this too. It's basically a TOTP with context. And so whether that's using login from an untrusted device, whether that's authenticating a payment, or whether that's making changes to my account, it's really it's an additional layer of security that I can use to authenticate without having to bring two factors online and with zero risk of any sort of man-in-the-middle attack. And then finally, there is push authentication. This is nothing new. We've had this feature for a few years. And in fact, most of our financial services and fintech customers have been using this in their applications because in addition to being more secure than SMS, because it's fully encrypted end-to-end, it also provides for the simplest user experience because I don't need to toggle, or the users don't need to toggle back and forth between apps. They can simply authenticate with the tap of a finger. And developers can actually build this functionality into their apps because we provide an SDK. So you can custom brand it, keep it within your application, and have a fully secure, modern authentication experience that is also strong and dynamically linked. So I've shown you a bunch of requirements and a bunch of ways to meeting those requirements. But all of these security measures also introduce friction in the transaction. And friction in transactions can affect the bottom line. Unfortunately, I think now with the risk of fraud the way it is, and especially with open banking opening up to the degree it is, this is really a tightrope that you're going to have to manage based on your environment, based on your requirements. So if you're a payment services provider, you need to make sure that you're offering all the ways of meeting SCA, whether that's through 3DS 2.0, whether that's through SMS or push or transactional TOTP, because your customers, right, if you as a payment services provider are offering services to, they will have different needs. If they're dealing with consumers directly, or if they're processing payments immediately, those will have different requirements, right? If I'm processing a payment immediately, I don't have time to run a fraud rate assessment as quickly as if I were to check into my hotel and not pay until I check out. So these are some of the considerations that, as you're implementing stronger security in your online payments, you need to make sure that, whether it's via SMS, which may be invalidated soon, whether it's through push authentication, whether it's transactional TOTP, that bringing this additional layer to payments online is best practices, and if it's not required by law, it's only going to reduce your likelihood of being one of the $50 billion in payments losses over the next few years. And with that, I just want to thank you guys, and if you have any questions, you can come up to the mic, and yeah, thank you all. Sure.
Hey, thanks. I was just wondering, I know a lot of banks are still using those hardware tokens. Mm-hmm. Why are still some of them, still using hardware tokens, still buying them, in particular to meet PSD2 regulatory deadline?
So I think the simpler way is that it is technically compliant. As I said, instead of using a second factor of your phone, you could use a YubiKey. It's a lot easier to hand out, I guess, hardware keys than to hand out new phones. That said, there is a problem of scale around that, right? And it works when you have a set number of employees, for example. But if you're going to hand out, think about it. If every payment over 30 euros is going to require authentication, you're talking about an order of magnitude increase in the amount of authentications that's going to happen. So it simply isn't feasible for that sort of approach to scale. That said, if you have a small set of customers or payment services providers that are using your service, then at least for now, and I think one of the reasons this is happening now is because the deadline is a few weeks away, and really what we're seeing is a lot of people are scrambling to put together some sort of compliance solution while they figure out a more long-term approach. And we've seen this with a lot of our customers that are using SMS for right now, but they're beginning to implement push into their applications to actually meet that requirement. But I think the answer to your question is that a lot of people right now are sort of in a desperate scramble to meet the deadline, and hardware token is a way of meeting that. Not the best way, not a scalable way, but that's kind of the reality right now.
Mm-hmm. And are all these API solutions provided by Twilio on its own, or do you guys partner with any other cybersecurity companies?
So we do the 3D Secure 2. That's actually not a Twilio product. That's just it's an initiative taken by the credit card providers, and which is why I mentioned it first, because I think it's probably going to be the biggest player in PSD2 compliance. But the other APIs, those are Twilio's own, and we've actually worked with our partners, our financial services partners, such as TransferWise and Banno, to develop, for example, transactional TOTP, because it has applications outside of Europe as well.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. If there's no other questions, I guess I must have done a good job. Thank you very much. Thank you all.